So what we're going to look at now is creating a custom auth policy or authorization policy, because there's a couple of methods inside our activities controller, the delete method and the edit method, and we only want these methods to be available to a user that is hosting the activity in question that they either want to edit or delete. No other users should be able to access these particular methods. Now, what we could do is add the logic inside the edit handler or the delete handler to test to see if the user is the host before allowing them to continue. And admittedly, that would result in less code than what we're going to write to create this authorization policy. But this is a training course, and on a training course we look at different ways of doing things, and it's a useful thing to be able to implement, because we might want to extend this application in a variety of different ways, and it might be useful to have a policy that checks if the user is an activity host before allowing them to continue. So let's take a look at how we can create a custom authorization policy. Now inside, and I'm just going to clean up my windows, and inside the infrastructure project, inside the security project, I'm just going to add a new class and call it isHostRequirements. And once again, VS Code has decided that it's not going to allow me to do this. So once again, I'll just disable and then re-enable the C# extensions and try this again and say new C# class and say isHostRequirements. And boom, it works. Okay. So what we want to do here is we want to add an interface, and this is going to be the authorization requirement interface. And all we need to do with this one is say using ASP.NET Core authorization. And we don't need to implement this at all. And below this, we need to create an isHostRequirement handler, and that's where our logic is going to go. So I'm going to say public class isHostRequirement handler, and this is going to make use of the authorization handler base class. And we need to specify the type of isHostRequirement inside here. And then what we need to do is implement the abstract class, and this is going to provide us with the handle requirement async method that we need to implement inside here. Now this gives us an authorization handler context, and it also gives us our requirements, our isHostRequirement requirements. Now what we need to do is we need to get our user and we need to get our activity, because those two bits of information we'll need to establish as to whether or not the currently logged in user is the host of an activity. So in the isHostRequirement handler, I'm going to generate a constructor, and inside here what we need is the iHTTP context accessor, and we used this before when we were getting our username from the context, and we're going to be using it for a similar thing here. So we need to bring this in, and we'll also need to bring in our data context and call it context so that we can get access to both the user and the activity. So I'm just going to bring in ASP.NET Core HTTP and also our persistence project here as well. And then we'll just need to initialize the fields from the parameters. And then we can remove this dot from both of these, and I'll just try and tidy things up a little bit. So inside the logic of our handle requirement async, and the first thing we want to do is we need to add a check and say if context, and this is going to be our authorization handler context we're accessing here. Bit confusing because we have two things named context, but when we're accessing our database context, it's going to be underscore context and not just context. And we want to check to see if the context dot resource is an authorization filter context, and we'll call it auth context, because when we use this particular custom auth policy, it's going to be an authorization filter that we're adding here, and we just need to bring in MVC filters. And then what we want to do inside here, if we are using an authorization filter context, then what we want to do is get the current username. So we'll say var current username equals, and then we'll need to access our HTTP context accessor. And we're just going to do the same thing we did to get our current username. So we're going to say HTTP context user, add the question mark, then claims, question mark, single or default. And this isn't going to be async because we're getting this from our token and not our database. And then we need to add the expression and say x.type is equal to claim types dot, and we'll need to bring in system security claims as well, and then say name identifier, and then after the parentheses another question mark dot value. And this gives us our current username. What we then want to do is get the activity ID of the activity that's attempting to be either edited or deleted in this particular example. And we can get this from our auth context. So what we'll do is we'll say var activity ID is equal to auth context dot root data dot values, and then we want to get the ID from the root data, and we'll pass this out to a string. And then we want to get our actual activity, so we'll say var activity is equal to, and this time we will use our database context, so we'll say underscore context activities, and then we can use find async, and we can pass in our activity ID here. And because we're not in the context of an async method, what we want to do is get the results of this. And this should give us our activity inside our activity variable. If we don't use d.results, then this is going to be a task of domain activity, whereas we obviously just want to get the activity from here instead of a task. And then what we want to do is get the host of the activity, so I'm going to say var host equals activity dot user activities, and then just use first or default and say x goes to x dot is host. And what we want to do then is check the host app user dot username and compare it with our current username, and if this matches, then we meet the requirements and the user can go ahead and edit or delete the activity. So we'll say if host, and we'll add the null check as well, because first or default could return null, and then we'll say app user, again the question mark, and then username is equal to the current username. And if this is the case, then we'll use our context, and this is going to be our authorization handler context, and then we'll say succeed, and then pass in the requirements. And at this stage, the user would move on to our edit or delete handler. And if they don't meet the requirement, then we'll add an else, and we'll just say context.fail. And then what we want to do below this is return the task.completed task. So a little bit complicated, and I agree it would be much easier just to add this particular check inside our edit and delete methods, because we already have access to the current username and the activity and the host, and we could simply check inside there. So this is a little bit unnecessary, and this is really just the fact it's a training course. We're looking at doing it this way. And what we then need to do is to go to our startup class, and we need to add our authorization policy in here, which makes use of the isHostRequirement handler. So I tend to like to keep all of my authorization and authentication stuff together, so I'm just going to add it below the identity builder. And what we'll do is we'll say services.addAuthorization, and we'll provide this with some options, and we'll say opt.addPolicy, and we'll call the policy isActivityHost, and then we need to specify the actual policy itself, so we'll say policy, and then we'll say the policy.requirements.add, and then we'll specify a new isHostRequirements inside here. And we also need to add our authorization handler as well. So what we also need to do is say services, and this time we'll use add transient. So it's only available for the lifetime of the operation, not the complete request. And we'll say iAuthorizationHandler, and we'll pass in the isHostRequirement_handler. So there we go, quite a lot of work to do what we're doing here, and we're still not quite finished. We've still got a tiny bit more to go. And the next part of this is in our activities controller. And what we'll do is in our edit command, what we'll add is we'll add an authorize attribute, and we'll pass in a policy here, and we'll set this equal to isActivityHost. And then we'll just do the same again for the delete methods and pass in this particular policy. And now what we have in place is the ability to check to see if the user's a host of the specified activity before they're allowed to edit or delete the activity. So we'll just go ahead and finish this off just by running some tests. And what we've also got here is an ability to log in as a different user and save the token to a different variable. And if I look inside here, we're going to log in as Tom. And if I look inside the tests, then we're going to set the token to Tom_token rather than just token, which is what we've been using for Bob's token. So I'm just going to send this and log in as Bob. And if I take a look, and we get the token back, and if I go and take a look at our global variables, then we've now got an additional variable for Tom_token, which should be a different token to the one we've got for Bob, and it is. It looked very similar actually when I first looked at this, but they are two different tokens and they end with a different... Yeah, that's fine. As long as they're different, that's fine. So I'm just going to cancel back out of this, and what we can do is check to see if we can edit an activity as Bob, who is the host. So let's go and get our activities just so that we can get the ID of the activity that Bob is hosting, and that's this one here. So I'm just going to copy this GUID and paste this into this particular request, which is to put into our activities. And if I look at the body, I'm just going to change the title in this one and say editing activity as Bob the host. And if I click on send, this should work just fine. But of course it hasn't, and let's take a look at the error here. And it's telling us that the dbset activity find was of type string, which does not match the property type of GUID. So obviously made a mistake here in the isHostRequirement class, and what we're doing here is we're getting our ID as a root parameter and converting it to a string. And of course, the findAsync method for our activity ID, this is expecting a GUID, which is the type of ID for our activities. What we need to do is we need to make this a GUID. So I'll say GUID.pass, and then we can wrap this around our toString method, and this will resolve the problem. And what we can do then is we can go back to Postman. What we should find is that now if I try this particular request again and attempt to edit the activity as Bob the host, then this time it works okay. And if I go and get the activity, we should find that the activity has been updated. So I'm just going to paste in the request into the get activity details request, and we can see the updated title. Now if we attempt to do the same thing as Tom, and we take a look at the body of the request, we're editing the activity as Tom, and it should fail with a 4A3. And in the headers we can see that we're using the Tom underscore token instead of Bob's token. So if I click on send this time, and of course it would help if I used the correct ID of the activity, so let's just grab this from the one I used for Bob and copy this into my clipboards, and then attempt to edit the activity as Tom. This time we should find the activity, and I'll click send, and this time we get a 4A3 forbidden. And that's what we're looking for here. What we should also be able to do is, I'm just going to take this same GUID and paste this into the delete activity as Tom, who is not the host of this activity. And we should also see a 4A3 forbidden for this one. And if I take the same GUID and where Bob is the host, and I attempt to delete this particular activity and click send, then this time we get a 200 OK. And if I attempt to go and get the activity that we've just been messing around with, I should find that this is no longer found because it's now deleted. So that's quite a bit of work for some relatively small functionality there. And what we'll take a look at next is cleaning up our database with some new seed data now that we have attendees that can go into our activities.